Bismillah wa salatu wa salam ala Rasulillah wa ala ali wa man wala wa ba'd. This evening, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala, we are going to be reading from the Sharh of Al-Aqeedah Al-Wasitiyyah, the original text by Shaykh al-Islam ibn Taymiyyah, and the explanation of Al-Imam Abdul-Aziz ibn Abdullah ibn Baaz, Rahimahullaah. Before we go to the topic that we're going to be looking at tonight, we're going to go back and look at some of the topics that we discussed last week from the questionnaire study guide for lecture number 5. We're going to go back and look at some of the topics that we discussed last week from questionnaire study guide for lecture number 5. The first question being, discuss briefly the main point that is taken from this third chapter as it relates to Sifat and Asma of Allah. The main point from this third chapter. Main point. Anyone? MashaAllah. Shall I answer for myself? No. And that was a very important point, yes. But that wasn't the main point. That was the second point. The first point, now.
Believing in the truthfulness of the messages and the affirmation of what they came with.
Okay, so the main point of this chapter was the title of the chapter. The main point was the title. The title. And the title is telling you what we're going to be talking about, right? So the main point was the title. Al-Iman bi-Sidq al-Rusul alayhim salam. Yani having Iman in the truthfulness of the messengers, fi kulli ma akhbaru bihi, in everything that they informed us about. Everything that they informed us about, we believe in it, that it's true. That's the main point of this chapter. That's what Shaykh al-Islam ibn Taymiyyah begins with. That's what he begins his statement with in this section. The second question, memorize the ayat from 37th surah, 180th ayat. Ayat 180. And discuss briefly its intended meaning as it relates to the Sifat and Asma of Allah. The ayat and what is its intended meaning. Now, anybody? Type, fadlu. Intended meaning, okay. What's the intended meaning? What is intended by the ayah?
That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is free from what they attribute to Him.
Okay, Allah is free from what they attribute to Him. More specifically though, first, let's hear the ayah. MashaAllah. The answer is pretty much correct, but there's something wrong with the answer. If we have to be meticulous, brothers, please be meticulous. The question is, memorize the ayah, 37th surah, 180th ayah. One ayah. And discuss briefly its intended meaning. What is the ayah, the 180th ayah? That's the ayah. Anybody else memorize this ayah? It's very important. It's very important. It's just a few words. Okay, before we finish this session tonight, I want somebody to recite this ayah to me from memory. Subhana. Walhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. That's 3 ayats. La bas, mashallah. 1 ayah. The 3 ayats we are in need of, for sure. But the question is asking for 1 ayah. Okay, please try to be meticulous. If I say, what did the Shaykh say? Tell me what he said. Not what you understood or what somebody else said. Tayyib. So this ayah is very important. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is declaring Himself to be free from what? Al-Mukhalifuna lil-Rusul. Yani what those who opposed the messengers said about Him falsely. He is declaring Himself to be free from what all of these people who made up things about Allah, contrary to what the messengers brought, what they said about Him. He is saying, He is declaring Himself to be free from that. So this is the first ayat of the 3 ayats in which there is what? There is negation. Allah is rejecting what the people of falsehood have said about Him. Tayyib. Question number 3. Discuss the other main point mentioned by the muallif, the author, in this chapter as it relates to the sifat and asma of Allah. The other main point of this chapter. Naam. Anybody? Naam, Talib.
That these attributes represent affirmation and negation.
Okay, that these attributes represent affirmation and negation. A little more specifically, the wording of the Shaykh, he said, قَدْ جَمَعَ, يعني that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala قَدْ جَمَعَ بين يعني فيما وصف وسمى به نفسه, يعني he has combined between that which he has described himself with and named himself with, between, yani he has combined between al-ithbat wa nafi, between affirmation and negation. Yani Allah has combined between these two things, affirming about himself names and characteristics or qualities, and negating from himself other characteristics or qualities. He has combined between the two of these things. This is the second main point of this chapter, the combining between affirmation and negation, or negation and affirmation, yani al-nafi wal-ithbat. The fourth question, identify the nafi, negation, and the ithbat, affirmation, in the mentioned ayat, plural, of Surah Al-Saffat, 37th Surah, ayat 180, 181 and 182. Where is the nafi and where is the ithbat in these three ayats? Naam, Abdul Wali.
He's negating false attributes.
Okay, he's negating false, that which has been falsely attributed to him. Where? Where is he negating it? 180. In the first ayat. In the first ayat, he is negating, yani what has been falsely attributed to him. And the affirmation?
This is lordship in the second ayat.
The second ayat? The second ayat is what? What's the second ayat? وَالسَّلَامُ عَلَى الْمُرْسَلِينَ. What's the next ayat? وَالْحَمْدُ لِلَّهِ رَبِّ الْعَالَمِينَ. Where's the affirmation? Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. That Allah is affirming for himself. Affirming for himself praise. Due to what? Due to his qualities of perfection. So he's praising himself due to his qualities of perfection. So the first ayah is the negation, negating whatever has been falsely attributed to him. And the third ayah is affirming all the qualities and characteristics of perfection. Yani the Shaykh, if we went back and reviewed, yani preview before you come to the class and review after you leave, the Shaykh very clearly stated this. Yani he explained these ayat and he made us to understand the importance of both negation and affirmation, and that in these ayats that's the point of this lesson, that Allah is combining between negation and affirmation. طيب. The fifth ayat, or the fifth question, what is the intended meaning of the description of the messengers, the rusul, as musaddaqoon? What is intended by describing them as musaddaqoon? Naam, who's saying something? Huh? I didn't do 4? I was ready to surrender. Because both of us are old enough to forget, right? No problem. What is the intended meaning of the description of the messengers as musaddaquna with fatta? Musaddaquna with fatta. Naam. Okay, that they speak the truth and live by it. Yani that is the meaning of the sadiq, right? Sadiquna, they speak the truth. Yani, or siddiq is the one who speaks the truth and acts according to the truth. But musaddaq is the ism maf'ul with fatta, which means what? That they should be believed. That they should be believed. Yani that it's obligatory to believe in the truthfulness of what they say. Yani musaddiq is the one who testifies that something is true, and musaddaq is the one that others testify that what that person is bringing is the truth. So the describing the messages as musaddaqoon means that it is obligatory upon the people who are responsible for their actions. It's obligatory upon them to believe in the truthfulness of the messengers. And a person doesn't have an option to believe what the messenger said or not. No, it's obligatory to believe what they have come with. Because what? Because they are sadiqoon. Because they are truthful. The only thing that came to them from Allah is the sidq, the truth. So we must believe in what they brought. What's the point here? The point is Shaykh al-Islam Taymiyyah is trying to make us to understand. In the previous chapter we talked about Allah, that we must believe what He said about Himself. If He says that He has a face, He has a face. Because number one, He is, because what? He's the most knowledgeable about Himself. And number two, He is the most truthful. And number three, He is ahsan hadithan. Ahsan hadithan. He is the best one in expressing Himself. He says exactly what He means. So now He's saying, likewise the messengers. We must believe what they brought, because they only came from Allah with the truth. So it's obligatory to believe what came in the Quran and what came in the Sunnah. What came in the Quran from Allah and what came from the messenger or the messengers passed until the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Question number 6. The obligation of believing in the truthfulness of the messengers must be accompanied by what? The obligation of believing in the truthfulness of the messengers must be accompanied by what? Abdul Wali.
To act upon what they came with.
And acting upon what, it's not enough to say I believe that the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam is truthful, that he told the truth, that what he brought is the truth. But a person must act upon it. Must act upon it. And this is a part of Iman, yani that a person believes in the truth in their heart, expresses it on their tongue, and they act upon it. They live by it. Question number 7. The Sharh, yani the explainer of the original text, that is Al-Imam Abdul-Aziz ibn Baaz, explains that affirmation of the sifat and asma of Allah must be free of what? Must be free from what? Yani the affirmation of the sifat or the names of Allah must be free from what? Must be without doing what? Okay, without adding or subtracting, absolutely, no doubt. But we talked about 4 principles, remember? Tahrif and ta'atil. And what? And takyif and tamthil. So here the Shaykh said that this affirmation, believing in the names and sifat of Allah, must be iman, affirmation, yani faith, bari'an min what? Making examples. Bari'an min at-tamthil. Free of making examples for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala from anything in the creation. There's no example of anything in the creation that can tell us about Allah, that resembles Allah. Question number 8. The Shari', yani the explainer of the original text, Al-Imam Abdul-Aziz ibn Baaz, explains that tanzih, declaring Allah to be free of resemblance to His creation, must be free from what? Must be, don't guess. Must be free from what? Naam. Talib. خلقه بريئا التعطيل, yani declaring Allah to be free of any resemblance, any similarity to anything in the creation, must be without what? Ta'atil. Meaning, we declaring Allah to be free from resembling anything in the creation without denying what He has said about Himself, without ta'atil, without denying. Because some people, they want to say He can't be like the creation, so he doesn't have a face, He doesn't have hands. It has to be declaring Allah free from resemblance of the creation, but without denying what He has said about Himself, what He has described Himself with. Question number 9. Allah praises Himself in Surah As-Safat 37, 182, because He is Al-Kamil. Because He is Al-Kamil. Because He is complete and perfect in what? He praises Himself because He is complete and perfect in what? Naam. Ahmed? Adam. Ahmed. 2 Ahmeds. Okay, where's Mahmoud then? Where? Oh, Mahmoud, you throw me off. You see people switching places and stuff. Allahumma musta'an. That's confusing me. Now, without what? He is kamil in what?
His divine being.
In His that, in His divine being, His essence, and also fi asma'ihi and wasifatihi. And because He is perfect, His divine being is perfect. His names are perfect. His descriptions or qualities are perfect. For that reason, He praises Himself. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. The last question, give an example of the tariqah, the way of the Quran and Sunnah of nafyun mujmalun and ithbatun mufassalun. And what is an example of the nafyun. What is nafyun mujmalun? What is nafyun mujmalun? What do we mean by that? Huh? General negation. Yani the negation that Allah uses mostly in the Quran and came in the Sunnah is general negation. Not negating, he's not tall, he's not short, he's not big. No, it's general negation. What is an example of that? Now, Surah Al-Ikhlas, what? Which ayah? Lam yalid wa lam yulad. That's general. It's general negation. Actually, this particular ayah is specific. We're going to come back to this, inshallah. We're going to come back to it specific, but it's from what is generally mentioned under negation. Now, what else? Laysa kamithlihi shay'un. There's nothing. That's general. There's nothing at all. So it's all inclusive because it includes everything. There's nothing like him. Also, anything else? فَلَا And he don't make for Allah any amdad, yani nid, rivals for Allah, while you know that He alone deserves to be worshipped. Yani of anything, nothing is a rival to Allah. So that's general negation. These are some examples of general negation. And the Shaykh, he also said, and then we said, give an example of ithbat mufassalun. What is ithbat mufassal? Naam.
Specific affirmation.
For specific or detailed affirmation. Detailed affirmation. And when he affirms for himself names and divine qualities, he gives details about that. He gives a lot of details. And some of the Shaykh gave examples of some of the names of Allah. He said, from some of the names that he mentioned, or others besides them. Okay, Al-Aziz, Al-Hakim, Naam, Al-Ra'uf, Al-Ahad, Naam, Al-Samad, and so on. So he gave, and he said that we saw in the Quran over and over and over again, Allah is affirming for Himself these beautiful names and lofty qualities or characteristics in detail. So this is a general rule, and there are some exceptions to this, and I think we'll come to that shortly. But what I want to emphasize here is that the rule in the Quran and in the Sunnah of Allah combining between nafi and ithbat is very important. That Allah negates, rejects descriptions, qualifications that are descriptions of defect, that are defective. He rejects that. And He affirms for Himself the qualities of perfection. Further, we said that the rejection of qualities of imperfection is general. Mostly it is general. There are some exceptions to it. And the affirmation of the qualities of perfection are mostly detailed. Mufassal. Are mostly detailed. That's what we covered last week. That's most of what we covered last week, or the important parts. And this evening, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala, we want to actually read from where we left off in English on page 27, like somewhere down the page, I guess, and in Arabic on page 23. But just to kind of put things in focus, I want to go back a little bit. To the beginning of this chapter. I want to go back to the beginning of this chapter just to read the statement, the important statement of Shaykh al-Islam Taymiyyah that relates to the part of the explanation that we're going to do tonight. The part of the explanation that we're going to do tonight, I'm going to just read from Shaykh al-Islam's original statement, that part, so that we can focus on that as we look at the explanation tonight. Bi-idhnillahi ta'ala. Yeah, please. Jazakallah khair. So on page 21 in English, on page 21, on page 21 in English, and on page 20 in Arabic, we're going to go back to the original statement of Shaykh al-Islam Taymiyyah. Bismillah. I don't know where it's at exactly in English, but in Arabic it's like halfway down the page, or the second, the first paragraph, line 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yeah. I want to read the statement of Shaykh Ibn Taymiyyah that we're going to be discussing the explanation of today. And part of it we discussed last week. We're going to discuss it a little bit further tonight, where Shaykh Ibn Taymiyyah says, it's right after the ayat. It's right after the ayat, halfway down the page. He says, قَدْ جَمَعَ فِي مَا وَصَفَ وَسَمَّ بِهِ نَفْسَهُ بين النفي والإثبات. يعني Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala وهو سبحانه وتعالى قد جمع, He has combined in that which He has described and named Himself with between negation and affirmation. And then he goes on to say that the Ahlul Sunnah wal Jama'ah, because of them adhering to the truth, they do not deviate from that which the messengers brought. And then he said, فَإِنَّهُ الصِّرَاطَ الْمُسْتَقِيمِ, because what they brought is الصِّرَاطَ الْمُسْتَقِيمِ. And we talked about it a little bit last week in the explanation, and the Shaykh is going to go a little bit further tonight with it. You want this? Yeah. So he said, because that is الصراط المستقيم, صراط الذين أنعم الله عليهم من النبيين والصديقين والشهداء والصالحين. Yani it is the path, he's describing the people of this path, الصراط المستقيم. It is those who Allah has granted His favor upon from the prophets, and those who are siddiq, truthful in their speech and in their action, the shuhada, the martyrs, and the salihin, the righteous. And then he said, وَقَدْ دَخَلَ فِي هَذِهِ الْجُمْلَةِ مَا وَصَفَ اللَّهُ بِهِ نَفْسَهُ فِي سُورَةِ الْإِخْلَاصِ. And so from amongst these ayat, where Allah combines between negation and affirmation, from amongst those ayat is what Allah has described Himself with in Surah Al-Ikhlas. And we're going to look at that surah tonight. He says the Surah Al-Ikhlas equals to 1/3 of the Quran. And in it, Allah says, قُلْ هُوَ اللَّهُ أَحَدْ اللَّهُ الصَّمَدْ لَمْ يَلِدْ وَلَمْ يُولَدْ وَلَمْ يَكُنْ لَهُ كُفُوًا أَحَدْ. And we're going to look at that in detail tonight. Then he said, وَمَا وَصَفَ بِهِ نَفْسَهُ وَمَا وَصَفَ بِهِ نَفْسَهُ فِي أَعْظَمْ آيَةٍ فِي كِتَابِهِ. And also, from amongst those ayat in which Allah has combined between negation and affirmation, from amongst those ayat is the greatest ayat in His book. Yani Ayatul Kursi, and then the Shaykh mentioned the whole of Ayatul Kursi, and we're going to look at it in detail tonight. After mentioning these two examples of where Allah combines between negation and affirmation in the way He describes Himself, negating qualities of imperfection and affirming for Himself qualities of perfection. After that, Shaykh al-Islam Ibn Taymiyyah said, and it's not in our book, in the Arabic text or in the English, somehow it got left out, but he said in the text, after mentioning Ayatul Kursi, he said, وَلِهَذَا كَانَ مَنْ قَرَأَ هَذِهِ الْآيَةِ فِي لَيْلَةٍ لَمْ يَزَلْ عَلَيْهِ مِنَ اللَّهِ حَافِظٌ لَا يَقْرَبُهُ شَيْطَانٌ حَتَّى يُصْبِحَ. Shaykh al-Islam Ibn Taymiyyah said, after mentioning Ayatul Kursi, and for this reason, it is such that whoever reads this ayah, Ayatul Kursi, in a night, any night, every night preferably, right? Whoever reads this ayah in a night, he will continue to have over him a hafiz that will protect him, and shaitan will not be able to come near him until the morning. So that was the end of the text of Shaykh al-Islam Ibn Taymiyyah's statement, and then we discussed last week the explanation from Al-Imam Abdul-Aziz ibn Baaz of the beginning, yani of what he said, and we reached the point that we want to go back to today. We reached the point where he's talking about As-Sirat al-Mustaqim, and where he begins to give a little bit of discussion about Surah Al-Ikhlas, and then discussion about Ayatul Kursi. So that part of the explanation we didn't do last week, but we did read, yani I think this is in English on page 27. I'm going to read the last paragraph that we read last week, and then I'm going to go into the next paragraph. It's on page 27, and I'm not exactly sure in English where, but on page 27 in Arabic. It's on page 23, yani near the top of the page, second paragraph about. He says, في آيات القرآن وفي السنة أيضا جمع بين النفي والإثبات. يعني in ayat of the Quran and in the Sunnah also, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has combined between negation and affirmation. النفي المجمل, general negation, الذي يتضمن تنزيه الرب عن كل ما لا يليق به وتقديسه سبحانه وتعالى عما يقوله أعداء الرسل عليهم السلام, وبين الإثبات المفصل من أسمائه وصفاته سبحانه وتعالى. So he said, In ayats of the Quran and in the Sunnah as well, Allah has combined between negation and affirmation. The general negation, which entails or includes the rejecting from Ar-Rabb, rejecting from Allah everything that is not befitting of Him. Yani is not suitable for Him to be described with or to be attributed to Him. And also declaring His perfection, yani being free from whatever the enemies of the messengers have said about Him. Whatever the enemies of the messengers ﷺ have said about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He said, combining between this general negation وَبَيْنَ الْإِثْبَاتِ الْمُفَصَّلِ and the detailed affirmation of His names and His sifat, His qualities or characteristics subhanahu wa ta'ala. And therefore the Ahlul Sunnah wal Jama'ah do not deviate, they do not go away from. Yani لَيْسَ لَهُمْ مَعَدَلْ أَمَّا جَاءَ بِهِ الْمُرْسَلُونَ. So they do not have any chance. It is not possible for them to deviate from that which the messengers came with. فَإِنَّهُ الصِّرَاطُ الْمُسْتَقِيمِ, because indeed it is the straight path. And here Al-Imam Abdul-Aziz ibn Baaz describes as-Sirat al-Mustaqim in these words. And these words are very important because we want to understand. The scholars sometimes explain the same thing in different ways. Many of the scholars said as-Sirat al-Mustaqim in simple language is al-ilm an-nafi' wal-amal as-salih. That's easy for a person to understand. The Sirat al-Mustaqim is beneficial knowledge and righteous actions. And a person has to have correct knowledge, and then they have to act upon it. Beneficial knowledge, not just any knowledge, beneficial knowledge. Primarily the Quran and Sunnah, and whatever is attached to that. And secondly, righteous actions, acting upon that knowledge. This is the straight path. Here, Shaykh Abdur-Aziz ibn Baaz Rahimahullaah describes the Sirat al-Mustaqim. He says, Huwa Tawheedullah. There's no contradiction, it's just a different manner of describing Sirat al-Mustaqim. He said, Huwa Tawheedullah. This is the last thing that we read last week. Huwa Tawheedullah wa ta'atuhu, and obedience to Him. Wal iman bihi wa bi asma'i wa sifati, and having iman in Allah and iman in His names and iman in His sifat, His qualities or characteristics or descriptions. Wa annahu la shabiha lahu, and there's nothing that resembles Him. Wa la kaf'a lahu, and there's nothing that is equal to Him. Wa la niddan lahu subhanahu wa ta'ala, and there's nothing that is a rival for Him. So here he describes as-Sirat al-Mustaqim as including the Tawheed of Allah and obedience to Allah. And obedience to Allah. And this is very important because a person can't establish Tawheed without being obedient to Allah, without obeying His commands and avoiding His prohibitions. So the Sirat al-Mustaqim requires that a person be obedient to Allah. Be obedient to Allah in that which He has commanded and that which He has prohibited. And then he said, an iman in Allah and His names and His sifat. And then in reference to our topic tonight, he says, included in iman in His names and His sifat, is that He doesn't have anything that resembles Him, or anything that's equal to Him, or anything that is a rival to Him. That's where we left off last week, and tonight, bi'ithnillahi ta'ala, we want to continue with that discussion of Sirat al-Mustaqim and the discussion concerning Surah Al-Ikhlas and Ayatul Kursi. And the Shaykh doesn't give a lot of detail about them, so inshallah we should be able to finish that tonight. Now, Bismillah. So in Arabic, I know where we're at. We're on page 23, halfway down the page. In English, 28. Jazakallah khair. Al-Imam Abdul-Aziz ibn Baaz continues his explanation of as-Sirat al-Mustaqim. فَهَذَا هُوَ صِرَاطُهُ الْمُسْتَقِيمِ. This is His straight path. الَّذِي قَالَ اللَّهُ فِيهِ, that Allah said concerning this straight path, اهْدِنَا الصِّرَاطَ الْمُسْتَقِيمِ. Yani we have been commanded in every rak'ah of every prayer, whether it is an obligatory prayer or a voluntary prayer, that we supplicate to Allah, asking Him to guide us upon the straight path. اهْدِنَا الصِّرَاطَ الْمُسْتَقِيمِ. This is the straight path, that we are talking about here. The path that Allah commanded us to ask to be guided upon. In Surah Al-Fatiha, first surah, 6 ayat. Sirat, and then he says this Sirat here describing the people of the straight path. Sirat alladhina an'ama Allahu alayhim min al-nabiyyin was-siddiqeen was-shuhada was-salihin. These are the 4 categories or groups of people, general groups of people that are the people of Sirat al-Mustaqim. The prophets, the truthful, the martyrs, and the righteous. From Surah An-Nisa, 4th Surah, 69th ayah. So this ayah tells us who are the people of the straight path. First and foremost, they are the prophets. And the next level of people are the Siddiq. Like Abu Bakr as-Siddiq, radiyallahu anhu. He is the best of humanity after the prophets and messengers. And this is the second level of humanity after the prophets and messengers. And he said also included in the people of the straight path are the martyrs and the righteous. After this, the Shaykh says, now he gives a second description of Sirat al-Mustaqim, other than what we read last week, which I reminded you of tonight. He says, Siratuhum, their path, yani the prophets and the truthful and the martyrs and the righteous, Siratuhum huwa al-iman billahi wa bi asma'ihi wa sifatihi. So what is their path? It is having iman in Allah and His names and His sifat. This is the path of the prophets and the truthful and the martyrs and the righteous. It is having iman in Allah and in His names and His sifat. وَتَنْزِيحُ اللَّهِ عَنْ مُشَابَهَةِ خَلْقِهِ, and declaring Allah to be free of any resemblance to anything in the creation. This is the path, yani as-Sirat al-Mustaqim, that a person has iman in Allah and His names and His sifat, and that he declares Allah to be free of any resemblance to anything in the creation. وَوَصْفُهُ بِصِفَاتِ الْكَمَالِ, and also not only declaring Him to be free of any resemblance of the creation, but also describing Him with the sifat of perfection, the qualities and characteristics of perfection. Yani it is incumbent upon us to describe Allah with the qualities of perfection that He has described Himself with, or that His Messenger Muhammad ﷺ has described Him with. We must describe Him with His qualities of perfection. وَطَاعَةُ أَوَامِرِهِ وَتَرْكُ نَوَاهِهِ, and also part of as-Sirat al-Mustaqim is that we be obedient to His commands, and that we abandon His prohibitions, that we leave off what He has prohibited, that we be obedient to the commands of Allah, and that we avoid, distance ourselves, and abandon prohibitions. وَالْوُقُوفُ عِنْدَ حُدُودِهِ, and here the Shaykh mentions another tremendous point, وُقُوفُ عِنْدَ حُدُودِهِ, and that a person stops at the boundaries that Allah has set. The boundaries that He said, yani of what is lawful and what is not lawful. Stopping at the boundaries. Don't go beyond the boundaries that Allah has set. هذا هو الصراط المستقيم. This is the straight path, the path of those who Allah has favored. He has blessed them, that is the prophets and the truthful and the martyrs and the righteous. And then the Shaykh says, فَجَمَعَ بَيْنَ التَّفْصِيلِ فِي الْإِثْبَاتِ وَالْإِجْمَالِ فِي النَّفِي. So here, yani, he goes back to our subject, that is that Allah has combined in describing Himself and in naming Himself between a tafsil, giving details in that which He affirms for Himself, and using general descriptions in that which He negates from Himself. Detailed affirmation, general negation. فَقَالَ تَعَالَى, here he goes into Surah Al-Ikhlas, yani the combining between affirmation and negation. فَقَالَ تَعَالَى قُلْ هُوَ اللَّهُ أَحَدٌ, say He, Allah is one, or Allah is the one. Allahu Samad, yani the one who is eternal, yani who has no need and everyone is in need of Him. Lam yalid wa lam yulad, and He doesn't give birth to a child, nor was He born. وَلَمْ يَكُنْ لَهُ كُفُوًا أَحَدٌ, and there is no one that is equal or comparable to Him. Surah Al-Ikhlas, ayats 1 through 4. After mentioning this, the Shaykh, he says in this explanation, فَذَكَرَ أَنَّهُ Allah. So Allah mentions and He affirms for Himself this name, Allah. And every name of Allah, as we mentioned previously in passing, that from the rules of Asma wa Sifat is that all of the names of Allah also include within them a sifa, a quality or characteristic that is derived from that name, while the opposite is not true. Not every description of Allah points to a name of His. And there are some descriptions of Allah that there's no name that matches it, but every name of Allah has within it yani a quality or characteristic of Allah, sifa. So he says, Allah here, He mentions that He is Allah, وَأَنَّهُ أَحَدٌ, and that He is one, unique. وَأَنَّهُ الصَّمَدُ, the one who is eternal, without need of anyone, and everyone is in need of him. ثُمَّ قَالَ, yani this is affirmation, that he is Allah, that he is Ahad, and that he is As-Samad. He is affirming these names for himself. And it didn't come in the Quran, Ahad, with yani Alif Lam al-Ta'rif. It came with Tanween, but in the Sunnah it came Al-Ahad. In the Sunnah it came as the name of Allah, Al-Ahad. ثُمَّ قَالَ لَمْ يَلِدْ وَلَمْ يُولَدْ. Then he said, he didn't yani give birth to a child, nor was he born. وَهَذَا تَفْصِيل خاصة بنفي الولادة لما يترتب عليه من النقائص. He said this is detailed, that is particular to the negation of wilada, of Allah giving birth to anything. Here is an exception to the rule of general negation. Here Allah is making a detailed negation, that he is mentioned specifically that he didn't give birth to anyone or anything, and he was not born. The Shaykh says, هذا تفصيل, detailed, خاص, particular, specific to nafi al-wilada. Specifically he's mentioning this detail of that he doesn't give birth to anything, nor was he born, due to the defects and deficiencies that are included in this description, yani of giving birth. There are many defects and deficiencies that are included in it, so Allah makes a specific negation of this particular quality. ثُمَّ عَمَّمَ, and then he went back to general negation, and he said, لَمْ يَلِدْ وَلَمْ يُولَدْ وَلَمْ يَكُنْ لَهُ كُفُوًا أَحَدٍ. He didn't, and he didn't, لَمْ يَكُنْ لَهُ كُفُوًا أَحَدٍ. He didn't, there was no one, nothing equal to him. لَمْ يَكُنْ لَهُ كُفُوًا أَحَدٍ. And this is similar, the general negation is similar to the saying of Allah in Surah Maryam, 19th Surah, 65th ayat, هَلْ تَعْلَمُ لَهُ سَمِيًّا. Do you know that he has any sami, anything, anyone that is equal to him or similar to him? فَلَا تَجْعَلُوا لِلَّهِ أَنْدَادًا وَأَنْتُمْ تَعْلَمُونَ. And the saying of Allah in Surah Baqarah, 2nd Surah, 22nd ayat, so don't set up any andad, any rivals for Allah, to be worshipped along with Allah, while you know that there's nothing that deserves to be worshipped along with him. Don't set up any rivals with Allah while you know that there are no rivals to him. And then he said also in Surah Shura, 42nd Surah, 11th ayat, لَيْسَ كَمِثْلِهِ شَيْءٌ. There's absolutely nothing that is like him. These are general negations. This is what he said concerning Surah Al-Ikhlas. Then he goes to Ayat Al-Kursi, and the Shaykh mentions a little bit of the descriptions that came in Ayat Al-Kursi, the names of Allah and the sifat of Allah that are mentioned in Ayat Al-Kursi, and he goes into some detail about Ash-Shafa'ah, intercession. So he says, هَكَذَا فِي آيَةِ الْكُرْسِي وَهَكَذَا. And likewise, it is similar, like in Ayatul Kursi, similar to this, that is the negation and affirmation being combined by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in that which he names himself with and in that which he describes himself with. Some of the scholars said that the names of Allah are all affirmation. The descriptions of Allah, some of them are affirmation and some of them are negation. Some he affirms for himself, and other descriptions he negates from himself. As far as names, he only affirms names for himself. Alright, and this is related to another topic that we might see in the course of this book, that the sifat of Allah are categorized from one angle as sifat that are thubutiyyah, that are affirmed for Allah, and sifat that are salbiyah, that are negated from Allah. So the scholars of Sunnah, sometimes they refer to the sifat of Allah in these two categories: those which are affirmed for him and those which are negated from him, thubutiyyah and salbiyah. And other words or other expressions are also used, but the point is that there are sifat of Allah that are affirmed for him, and there are sifat of Allah that are negated from him, and it's incumbent upon us to affirm what he affirms and to negate what he negates. هكذا في Ayatul Kursi, Allah in Ayatul Kursi, he has affirmed for himself certain names and characteristics or qualities, and negated from himself certain characteristics or qualities, sifat. He says, Allahu la ilaha illa huwa al-hayyul qayyum la ta'khudhuhu sinatun wala nawm. Surah Baqarah, second surah, 255th ayat. And all that came after this is from this ayat from Surah Al-Baqarah. He says, that Allah, there's nothing that deserves to be worshipped except Him. He is Al-Hayyu and He is Al-Qayyum. So here we have three names of Allah, and we have Al-Hayy, the one who has perfect life, and Al-Qayyum, the one who sustains himself, maintains himself, and maintains everything else. And He sustains Himself, so He doesn't need anyone else. And He sustains everything else, so everything is in need of Him. That's the meaning of Al-Qayyum, as some of the scholars explained it. Then he said, so here there's, now perhaps you can say there's affirmation and negation. He's affirming Allah for Himself, and he's negating La ilaha illa huwa. He's negating uluhiyyah to anyone other than Himself. And then he's affirming names, Al-Hayy and Al-Qayyum, and then he's negating La ta'khuduhu sinatun wa la nawm. He is not overcome by slumber nor sleep. The Shaykh says, فَنَفَى عَنْهُ السِّنَةِ وَهُوَ النُّعَاسِ. He has negated from himself as-sina, and that is sleepiness, slumber. Not complete sleep. Shaykh Salih Fawzan said it means the sleep that only reaches the eyes, as opposed to nawm is heavy sleep that reaches the heart. He has negated from himself both of these. He says, as-sina huwa an-nu'as, sleepiness. وَالنَّوْمُ هُوَ مَا ثَقُلَ مِنَ النَّوْمِ, a heavier sleep. لِأَنَّهُ, he has negated these from himself, لِأَنَّهُ سُبْحَانَهُ مَوْصُوفٌ بِكَمَالِ الْحَيَاةِ, because he is described with the perfection, life, the perfect, perfection of life. His life is perfect. And here there's a point that we want to note here, is that from the rules of Asma wa Sifat is that negating any quality or characteristic from Allah in and of itself is not perfection. The perfection is in affirming the opposite of what is negated. And when Allah negates that He is affected by sleep or slumber, this is to affirm that the perfection of His life is not affected by sleep or slumber. So the point is what? That negation in and of itself is not praiseworthy. What's praiseworthy is to affirm the opposite of that. What is the negation for? It is to affirm the opposite of it. Negating imperfection to affirm the opposite characteristic of perfection. The opposite characteristic of perfection. So he says, he's negating slumber and sleep from himself, لأنه سبحانه موصوف بكمال الحياة, because he is described with having perfect life. لأن النعاس والنوم نقص في الحياة, because this sleepiness and sleep is a defect in life. والله منزه عن ذلك, and Allah is declared to be free of any defect. وهو الحي الذي لا يموت, He is the one who has perfect life, who doesn't die. He doesn't die. والنوم نوع من الموت, and sleep is a type of death. Sleep is a type of death, and Allah doesn't die. So this is the characteristic of imperfection that Allah is negating from Himself due to what? Because He just affirmed He is Al-Hayy Al-Qayyum, that He has perfect life. Therefore, He's negates from Himself any type of imperfection in life. Then he says, the next part of the ayat, لَهُ مَا فِي السَّمَاوَاتِ وَمَا فِي الْأَرْضِ, to Him belongs whatever is in the heavens and whatever is in the earth. Malik kulli shayin, Allah is the one who owns and possess and controls and masters everything in the heavens and in the earth. So this is affirmation for Allah of what? Of the greatness and the magnificence of His power and His authority, that He owns everything in the heavens and the earth. Then he says, مَنْ ذَا الَّذِي يَشْفَعُ عِنْدَهُ إِلَّا بِإِذْنِهِ, who is it that can intercede with Him except by His permission? So in a sense you can say it is clearly the meaning here, مَنْ ذَا الَّذِي يَشْفَعُ لَا أَحَدْ يَشْفَعُ. The meaning here, who can intercede? The meaning is no one can intercede in His presence. عِنْدَهُ إِلَّا بِإِذْنِهِ, except with His permission. General permission or specific permission. يعني لا أحد يشفع عنده إلا بإذنه يوم القيامة والرسل والصالحون يشفعون بإذنه سبحانه وتعالى. And he said the meaning of this ayat is what? There is no one that can intercede with him except with his permission on the day of resurrection. Here's the allusion to what? That what about in this world though? On the day of resurrection, no one can intercede except with his specific permission. And specific permission will be given to the messengers and to the righteous, and they will intercede by his permission on Yawm al-Qiyamah. Then he says, أَمَّا فِي الدُّنْيَا, that's on Yawm al-Qiyamah, but what about in this world? فَاللَّهُ سُبْحَانَهُ أَمَرَ النَّاسِ جَمِيعًا أَنْ يَدَعُوهُ وَيَخُصُّهُ بِالدُّعَاءِ. Yani Allah has commanded the people, yani the believers, all of them, to supplicate to Him alone and to single Him out with dua, with supplication. وَيَشْفَعُوا لِإِخْوَانِهِمْ فِي اللَّهِ فِي الدُّنْيَا, and that they should intercede for their brothers in Allah, yani brothers in Islam, in this world. Allah has commanded in the dunya that the believers intercede for one another, that they speak up for one another and look out for one another. He has commanded this. وَكَانَ النَّبِيُّ صلى الله عليه وسلم يشفع إذا طلب منه الشفاعة إذا طلب منه أحد أن يشفع أو يتخلص من قرب أو نحو ذلك فيدعو لهم عليه الصلاة والسلام. Yani the Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم, whenever these acts, when he was requested to intercede for somebody, when he was requested by anyone, yani to make intercession for them or to help them to get away from, to escape from some difficulty or hardship or whatever is similar to that, then he would supplicate for them, alayhi salatu wasalam. Then he would supplicate for them. Then the Shaykh, he says, وَأَمَّا يَوْمُ الْقِيَامَةِ. He goes back to, we're talking about shafa'ah in this world. Allah has commanded the Muslims, the believers, to intercede for each other, to help one another, to support one another, to defend one another, to look out for one another. But as far as on Yawm al-Qiyamah, that's a different matter altogether. أَمَّا يَوْمُ الْقِيَامَةِ فَلَا أَحَدٍ يَشْفَعُ إِلَّا بِإِذْنِهِ. No one can intercede for anyone except by the permission of Allah. أَمَّا فِي الدُّنْيَا يَشْفَعُونَ بِإِذْنِهِ الْعَامِ. In this world, people can intercede by His general permission. He has given general permission that the believers intercede for each other, that they speak up for each other. So a person doesn't need specific permission. In this world, you should intercede for the believers. لأنه أذن في الشرع أن يشفع المسلمون بعضهم في بعض. Because He has given permission in the law, in the Sharia, that the Muslims intercede, some of them, yani for one another, that they intercede for one another. So He said, من يشفع شفاعة حسنة يكون له نصيب منها. And whoever intercedes a good intercession in a good matter for someone, then he will have a reward. He will have some reward for doing so. This is in Surah An-Nisa, 4th Surah, 85th ayah, meaning that Allah is telling us here, He's encouraging us to intercede for one another. Look out for the believers, and you will get a reward with Allah on Yawm al-Qiyamah. أذنهم سبحانه وحثهم على هذا. He gave permission and He encouraged the people in the dunya, the believers, to intercede for one another. وعلى التعاون على البر والتقوى, and that the people cooperate with one another in righteousness and piety. والتناصح والتواصي بالحق, and that the people advise one another and enjoin upon one another the truth. والشفاعة من التواصي بالحق, and this interceding for one another is an aspect of يعني تواصي بالحق, enjoining truth upon one another. ومن الإحسان, and goodness towards one another. فهي جائزة في الدنيا بإذنه العام. So it is permissible to intercede يعني for one another in this world based upon Allah's general permission, يعني to intercede for one another in the dunya. وفي الآخرة لا تصلح الشفاعة إلا بإذن خاص. But as far as in the next life, then yani interceding or intercession is not going to be valid except with a special permission from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. لا أحد يشفع إلا بإذنه سبحانه. No one can intercede except by his permission. ولهذا يتقدم الناس يوم القيامة إلى آدم ونوح وإبراهيم وموسى وعيسى عليهم السلام كلهم يعتذرون حتى يتقدم نبينا محمد عليه الصلاة والسلام فيسجد بين يدي ربه تحت العرش ثم يحمد الله بمحامد عظيمة يفتتحها عليه ثم يؤذن له يقال اشفع يشفع. And here he gives an example on the day of resurrection when he said no one will be able to intercede except with special permission from Allah. So the people on that day would step forward. They would go forward on Yawm al-Qiyamah to Adam alayhi salam and ask him to intercede for them from the difficulty and the horror of the standing on the day of accounting. And they will go to Nuh alayhi salam and Ibrahim and Musa and Isa alayhi salam, may the peace of Allah be upon all of them. Every one of them will excuse himself. I'm not the one for this. I don't have permission to intercede on this matter. Until the people will go to our Prophet Muhammad alayhi salatu wasalam, and he would respond and he would prostrate in front of his Rabb under the arsh of Allah, and then he would praise Allah with magnificent words of praise that Allah will inspire him with at that time that he didn't know before. And then he will be given permission. It will be said to him, intercede and your intercession will be accepted. All of this is a side note dealing with ash-shafa'a. That's not like focused on the ayat itself, but it's part of the ayat. So the Shaykh is taking advantage of the opportunity here to mention the importance of intercession, the benefit of interceding for one another in this world, the importance of Muslims looking out for one another, and then the seriousness of the matter on Yawm al-Qiyamah, that nobody would be able to speak up for anybody except by special permission from Allah. The Shaykh, he closes by saying, فَهَذِهِ الْآيَةِ آيَةُ الْكُرْسِي أَعْظَمُ آيَةٍ فِي كِتَابِ اللَّهِ. This ayat, that is Ayatul Kursi, it's named Ayatul Kursi because of the mention of the Kursi in the ayat. And what is correct is that the Kursi is not the Arsh. The Kursi is not the Arsh. Even though it has been said by some that the Kursi is the Arsh, it's clear from authentic hadith that the Kursi is not the Arsh, that these are two different creations of Allah. So he said, this ayah, Ayatul Kursi, is the greatest ayat in the book of Allah. فيها إثبات ونفي. It contains affirmation, the qualities of perfection for Allah and the names of Allah. And it contains nafyun, negation of any quality or characteristic or description of imperfection or whatever has been falsely attributed to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then he begins with Al-Hayy Al-Qayyum. After Allah, La ilaha illa huwa Al-Hayy Al-Qayyum. So the first affirmation is Allah, and the first negation is La ilaha illa huwa. La ma'bud bihaqqin illa Allah. No one deserves worship, or nothing deserves worship except Allah. And then he goes to the affirmation, Al-Hayy Al-Qayyum, Hadi Ithbat. These are names that are affirmed for Allah. Al-Hayy Al-Qayyum, the one who has perfect life, and Al-Qayyum, the one who maintains himself and maintains everything else in the creation. Hadi Ithbat. La ta'khudhuhu sinatun wala nawm. And he is not overcome by sleepiness or slumber, and he is not overcome by sleep. He says, هذا نفي. حي القيوم is إثبات. Next one is negation. لا تأخذه سنة ولا نوم. له ما في السماوات وما في الأرض. To him belongs everything that is in the heavens and earth. هذا إثبات. من ذا الذي يشفع عنده إلا بإذنه. هذا نفي. So you can see in this ayat there is affirmation and negation. Affirmation and negation. Affirmation and negation. Shaykh Islam Taymiyyah mentions these two examples because of the importance of Surah Al-Ikhlas. That it is pure Tawheed. And he mentions Ayatul Kursi because of what it contains also. And then after this he mentions 100 and something, 11 ayat from the Quran containing names and qualities of Allah. Yani the next few chapters are going to be just the mention of ayat from the Quran and so many hadith. I think 16 hadith that contain the qualities and characteristics of Allah and the names of Allah in the Quran and in the Sunnah. All of that, these are just samples of the combining of Allah between affirming for Himself qualities of perfection and the beautiful names that belong to Him, and negating from Him qualities of imperfection. But he started with these two examples because of the greatness of this surah and the greatness of this ayah. And perhaps that's a hint to us of the importance of these verses from the Quran, this surah and this ayah, that a person needs to understand them well and needs to reflect upon them carefully, regularly, and recite them all the time. We should recite them all the time. One of the hadith that came, I'm not quoting it verbatim, but one of the hadith that came concerning Surah Al-Ikhlas is that a man was reciting, one of the companions heard a man reciting Surah Al-Ikhlas and repeating it. And he went to the Prophet the next day as though he kept saying the same thing over and over again. This is not, it's not that important. And the Prophet told him that this is equal to 1/3 of the Quran. This Surah Al-Ikhlas is equal to 1/3 of the Quran. Don't belittle it. Don't think it's nothing. And if a person, and in another narration, an authentic hadith, a man was appointed to be the leader of a detachment, an army detachment. And the leader of the army is the person who leads the prayer. The leader of the Muslims is the person who leads them in prayer. The ruler leads the people in prayer. That's how it used to be. So he kept, he would always recite a surah and with it Surah Al-Ikhlas. And the people didn't like it. So they complained. And the Prophet ﷺ told him, go back and ask him why. And he said, because I love this surah because it is a description of Allah. Or something to that effect. And the Prophet said to go back and tell him that because of your love of this, Allah loves you. These are indications of the importance of certain things in the Quran. The whole of the Quran is the speech of Allah and it's all magnificent. But some of it is superior to others. So Shaykh al-Islam ibn Taymiyyah begins with this surah and this ayat because of their superiority over other surahs and other ayats in the Quran. So to close, the Shaykh says, I think the last one I read, مَنْ ذَا الَّذِي يَشْفَعُ عِنْدَهُ إِلَّا بِإِذْنِهِ. Who is it that can intercede except with his permission? No one can intercede except with his permission. This is nafi, negation. The negation of anyone having the ability to intercede with Allah due to His greatness and His magnificence and His power and authority. No one, absolutely no one, no exception, no one can intercede with Him except by His permission. The prophets and messengers and the righteous and the martyrs will intercede by permission of Allah on Yawm al-Qiyamah. This shows the greatness of Allah. And again, the negation here of anyone having the ability to intercede, the benefit of it, the praiseworthiness of it is in affirming the opposite. That it affirms Allah's greatness and His power and His authority to the extent that no one can intercede except with His permission. Then he says, يَعْلَمُ مَا بَيْنَ أَيْدِيهِمْ وَمَا خَلْفَهُم. He knows what is before them and what is behind them, of the past, present and future. He knows everything. His knowledge is perfect. This is ithbat, the perfection of the knowledge of Allah, of everything. وَلَا يُحِيطُونَ بِشَيْءٍ مِّنْ عِلْمِهِ إِلَّا بِمَا شَاءَ. And he goes to the end of the ayat, وَسِيَ كُرْسِيهُ السَّمَوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ وَلَا يَؤُودُهُ حِفْظُهُمَا وَهُوَ الْعَلِيُّ الْعَظِيمُ. That لَا يُحِيطُونَ بِشَيْءٍ مِّنْ عِلْمِهِ إِلَّا بِمَا شَاءَ. That the people, they cannot encompass anything of the knowledge of Allah إِلَّا بِمَا شَاءَ, except what He wills. And here it seems as though the Shaykh, he just went through it. He didn't mention negation, affirmation, but certainly we could see that لَا يُحِيطُونَ بِشَيْءٍ مِّنْ عِلْمِهِ, the negation of anyone being able to encompass the knowledge of Allah. And that, the opposite of it is what? The affirmation of the vastness of Allah's knowledge. The negation here is to affirm the perfection and the vastness of Allah's knowledge. And also, Shaykh al-Uthaymeen Rahimahullaah said, إِلَّا بِمَا شَاءَ. This is also affirmation of Allah's Mashiach, that Allah has will. This is also affirmation that Allah wills. وَسِيَ كُرْسِيهُ السَّمَوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ. His kursi extends or expands over the heavens and the earth. Over the heavens and the earth. And this is ithbat, affirmation which shows, if his kursi extends over the heavens and the earth, and that's just his kursi, then what about the whole kingdom of Allah and the greatness and the magnificence and the power of the one who created it and owns it and controls it. وَلَا يَعُودُهُ حَفْظُهُمَا وَهُوَ الْعَلِيُّ الْعَظِيمُ. وَلَا يَعُودُهُ حَفْظُهُمَا, and his protection and preservation of the heavens and the earth and everything in the creation doesn't tire him, doesn't make him weary, doesn't get him tired. This is negation. And it's negation that shows what? The perfection of Allah's power. That He doesn't become tired, He doesn't become weary. Everything is easy for Him. هو العلي العظيم. This is ithbat, affirmation of the names Al-Ali and Al-Azim, the Most High and the Most Great, or the Supreme. And then the Shaykh closes. I wasn't paying attention to the time, but we're still good. And then the Shaykh closes, he says, فَبَيَّنَ كَمَالَهُ وَأَنَّهُ الْعَلِيُّ الْعَظِيمُ. So Allah, in this, He has made clear His perfection. وَأَنَّهُ الْعَلِيُّ الْعَظِيمُ. He is the Most High, Al-Azim. And some of the scholars, Shaykh al-Taymiyyah mentioned it in a simpler way that's easier to follow. He said that Al-Ali, from the sifa that is contained in the name Ali, is Al-Ulu, the highness of Allah, the loftiness of Allah. And he said Al-Ulu is of two types. Shaykh al-Uthaymeen said in one place, he said it is Ulu al-Dhat and Ulu al-Sifat. Ulu al-Dhat and Ulu al-Sifat. That Allah's highness is His divine being, His essence is high above everything in the creation. And Ulu al-Sifat, His qualities and characteristics and descriptions are lofty or high or greater than everything else. And some scholars explained it a little bit differently, but the meaning is still the same. Ulu al-Dhat and Ulu al-Qadr and Ulu al-Qahr. That Allah's names and sifat are high, and Allah's power, His dominion, His dominance over everything is high, in addition to the highness of His Dhat. Shaykh says, وَأَنَّهُ كَامِلَ الْحَيَاةِ, that His life is perfect. From al-Hayy al-Qayyum. وَأَنَّهُ الْمَالِكُ لِكُلِّ شَيْءٍ, and He is the one who owns everything. لَهُ مَا فِي السَّمَوَاتِ وَمَا فِي الْأَرْضِ, that He is the owner and controller and master of everything in existence. And then the Shaykh closes by saying, فَالْوَاجِب, after reading this Ayatul Kursi and all of these descriptions of Allah's greatness and His magnificence and His power and His authority and the affirmation of these lofty names for Him, he says, فَالْوَاجِب الضَّرَاعَةُ إِلَيْهِ وَالسُّؤَالُهُ سُبْحَانَهُ وَتَعَالَى وَاللُّجُوءُ إِلَيْهِ فِي كُلِّ شَيْءٍ. So what is obligatory upon us is that a person humbly, submissively turns to Allah and begs Him and ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and seek refuge in Him in everything, in every matter. And if we know this is a description of Allah in one ayah in the Quran, and what came in Surah Al-Ikhlas, then it is incumbent upon us to humbly turn to Him and beg Him for our needs and ask Him for whatever it is that we need, and to turn to Him and seek refuge in every situation or circumstance. بِيَدِهِ تَصْرِيفَ الْأُمُورِ, in His hands is the control, the disposal of all affairs. وَلِهَذَا يَقُولُ سُبْحَانَهُ, and for this reason Allah, the one who is free from imperfections, He says, أُدْعُونِي أَسْتَجِبْ لَكُمْ, call upon me, supplicate to me, and I will answer you. Supplicate to me, and I will answer you. And that's a promise from Allah. If you call upon Him, He will answer you. And His answering doesn't necessarily mean that He's going to give you what you ask for, but it means He's going to respond. As the Prophet ﷺ said, in one of three ways. Either He's going to give you what you ask for now, or He's going to store it up for you as a reward equal to that in the next life, or He's going to turn away from you something that was decreed to befall you of harm. The companion said, إِذَا نُكْثِرْ, if that's so, that He's definitely going to respond in one of these ways, then we're going to ask a lot. And the Prophet said, Allahu Akthar, more than you can ask, Allah will give. Call on me, I will answer you. Surah Al-Ghafir, 40th Surah, 60th ayat. وَيَقُولُ, and Allah also said, وَاسْأَلُوا اللَّهَ مِنْ فَضْلِهِ, ask Allah from His bounties, His favors, His blessings. Ask Allah, He has all of this. And he's telling you, ask. So why we don't ask? And how often we are not making dua? Listen to what I said. How often we are not making dua? And how much time do we spend in a day that we don't ask Allah for anything? Are we not in need? And Allah is commanding us. This is the command. Fil amr. Al-amr yaqtadi al-wujub. Was'alullaha. He's commanding us to ask Him from His bounties, His unlimited treasures that He's ready to give. In Surah An-Nisa, this 4th surah, 32nd ayah, وَيَقُولُ جَلَّ وَعَلَى, and He also says, وَإِذَا سَأَلَكَ عِبَادِ عَنِّي فَإِنِّي قَرِيبٌ أُجِيبُ دَعْوَةَ الدَّاعِ إِذَا دَعَانِ. Surah Al-Baqarah, 2nd surah, 186th ayah. And when my ibad, my worshippers, ask you about me, He's saying to the Prophet ﷺ, when they ask you about me, فَإِنِّي قَرِيبٌ. Allah says, He answers Himself, He says, I am near. I am near. And I answer the call, the supplication of the one who calls upon me, if and when he calls. And you have to ask. You have to call upon Allah. And if you call, then Allah answers. This is the end of what we wanted to say for tonight. And we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to help us to take these matters seriously, to understand that this is the foundation of our deen, that the Aqeedah is the foundation of Islam. And the Tawheed, and especially Tawheed al-Asma wa Sifat, is the core of our Aqeedah. And the Tawheed of Asma wa Sifat is the area of Tawheed that most Muslims don't know about. Most Muslims don't know about. And so this is of the utmost importance. A person has to take it seriously. We have to study this more than we study for an exam in college. Or if we didn't go to college in high school, or whatever school we went to, or whatever course we took, or whatever trade we studied. This is more important than all of that. Because those things are important, no doubt. This is more important. Because our Aqeedah, if it is correct, then we have a chance. And if it's not, we're in trouble. May Allah grant us, give us the ability to understand the importance of studying this matter, and to give time to it, and to devote ourselves to it. It's not just something that we're going to come and sit for an hour once a week, but rather every day. A person should. This book is a very brief explanation of Aqeedah Al-Wasitiyyah, and there are other explanations. Shaykh Salih Fawzan has a more expansive explanation. Shaykh Muhammad ibn Salih al-Uthaymeen has a tremendous explanation, that if a person were to read from them, they will benefit a lot. Shaykh Salih Fawzan's explanation is translated into English, no excuse. Shaykh Muhammad ibn Salih al-Uthaymeen's explanation is translated into English in 2 volumes, about 1,000 pages. And if somebody took the time to translate that, nobody has an excuse not to read it. Again, subhanakallahumma wa bihamdika ashhadu an la ilaha illa anta astaghfiruka wa atubu ilayk. If there's any questions or any corrections or any comments, we'll take them inshallah after we dismiss. And whoever would like to stay, inshallah, we have a little bit of refreshments that we can share with each other. We'll take the questions at that time. Bi-idhnillahi ta'ala. Barakallahu feekum wa jazakumullahu khairan.